Thank you and good evening to all, and thank you for welcoming me here. Maybe, because we are not very numerous, if I could know what the background, and maybe more for the students. Are you students in economics or not at all, or no? Well, if you could just briefly say what you are studying.
Classics.
Classics. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Biomedical science.
Biomedical science.
History.
History. Yeah. Law. Other professional management. Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I could begin with a personal experience I had on the 1st of January. I was discussing with some people about the necessary changing in the curricula in what we call in France grandes écoles, and I received the wishes of the managing director of one of the schools where I do some research, and he said to all the professors and the staff that his wishes were about the rankings of the school, the international rankings, and it was just about this. He mentioned the fact that we are, as a community of researchers, professors, and staff, we had to do the most in order to achieve the highest possible rankings for the school, and that was it. Nothing about climate change, about the big issues that businesses will face and all of us will face in the next decades. And I received this mail, and it was on the 1st of January. And when you receive this kind of letter, you think, well, not what do I do here, but how can people be so much involved or in a narrow perspective or in a business-oriented perspective? I don't know how to name this kind of letter, but it's quite surprising and also frustrating. And maybe, I don't know if the students in management, how you would react if you were told that the only interesting thing is to care for the rankings or the level of the salaries when you graduate from this school. Maybe it's not enough to give you the feeling that your life is fulfilled, that you are flourishing and all this. So I wanted to begin with this because I think it says something about the huge challenges that we have in front of us. Because the same school and the same professors and the directors of these schools will also acknowledge that climate change is a big issue and that we have to change things in the curricula. But then the question is, what do we do? And also in terms of public policies, are we up to the challenges that we will have to, all of us will have to face and the future generations? And I think that the encyclical letter from Pope Francis, Laudato Si, which is a letter which has been written in order to prepare COP21 and to help people from different religions and people who are looking for who want to care for the planet and for the quality of life on Earth. This text can be very helpful in order to reflect on the responsibilities of businesses, but also of all of us as consumers and citizens, in order to promote what the Pope calls integral ecology. So I would like to give this talk on how, in the encyclical letter, Pope Francis reflects on the challenges for businesses, and I think he suggests some paths forward, and I will try to combine a reflection or try to analyze what the Pope says, and also I would provide examples related to the work that I've been carrying out with other people from different disciplines, and not only researchers, but also people working in big companies or in social businesses, or activists, NGOs, and people who think that if we want to change things, we have to promote what in the company they speak of stakeholder management. But at least we can foster a dialogue between and among people who may not have frequent opportunities to discuss with one another. I think it's a major challenge today. It's to go from a perspective where you have people from the big business working with a certain kind of mindset, people in NGOs, local communities, maybe public authorities, and try to connect all these people and try to reflect from a different perspective. So I would like first to highlight the fact that when the Pope speaks of global challenges, he uses the image of the polyhedron as compared to the image of the sphere, and he says that we have to favor the polyhedron because, I quote, could someone read the quotes? Because... Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much.
Our image of globalization should not be the sphere, but the polyhedron. It expresses how unity is created while preserving the identities of the peoples, the persons, of the cultures.
I think it's interesting because when we speak about climate change and ecology, sometimes we think that we have to promote common norms and regulations, and I think it's important, but then how can we take into account the diversity of cultures, of representations, of, for example, what is a flourishing life and all this. And the Pope insists a lot on taking into account the different contexts. Then another, maybe also the major aspect of the encyclical letter is to show that you don't have ecology on the one hand and social issues on the other hand. We have to combine both. So if you could read, or somebody.
Yes. Today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.
This also, I think it's a very powerful sentence, and sometimes we feel that ecology is a matter for rich people or people who can afford to buy, like, I don't know, good food and all this. And if we try to reflect on our consuming choices, we can see that very often we don't take into account some of the aspects related to, for example, global value chains. I will speak about it later. What are the living and the working conditions for the people who have, for example, built a computer or I don't know, any device. And also we sometimes, in UK or in France, we don't pay attention to the way we think that we have to promote good food and not rather than junk food, but can poor people afford to buy this food, which is much more expensive? So when the Pope said that we have to listen to the cry of the earth and to the cry of the poor, it means that this has consequences on the way we reflect on our own lives and maybe make different choices in order to meet the needs of the others. So then he takes he speaks of Saint Francis and saying that it's the example par excellence of care for the most vulnerable and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. And I think it's a beautiful quotation because also he highlights the fact that it shouldn't be a bad news to care for the planet and to care for the most vulnerable people, and we could try to represent our lives in a more meaningful way while taking into account ecological issues, and which are also social issues. So I remind you just of how the encyclical letter is conceived. You have 6 chapters. First, a diagnostic about the situation. and the seriousness of the situation, the urgency to act and react. Then the gospel of creation, it's more it's a more theological perspective, where the Pope highlights some issues which are related to a relational ontology and relational anthropology. And then he tries to deepen the reflection on the roots and the human roots of the ecological crisis. I will say something about this. Then the fourth chapter is devoted to the notion of integral ecology, before highlighting the need for dialogue between science and religions, between political leaders and economic leaders. So the fifth chapter is about this, all the different kinds of dialogue that we have to promote. And the sixth chapter is about education and spirituality, and where the Pope he uses, in French we have a thinker who is not a Christian, who speaks of happy sobriety. I think it's better to translate it into happy frugality in English, because sobriety is about not drinking. Yes. So, but in French it's sobriété heureuse. So in English, happy frugality, the idea that we can live differently, and it is a source of joy. So I would like now to just focus on integral ecology and try to see how it applies to business. Can you read?
What is integral ecology? The social dimensions of global change include the effects of technological innovations on employment, social exclusion, and inequitable distribution and consumption of energy and other services, social breakdown, increased violence, and a rise in new forms of social aggression, drug trafficking, growing drug use by young people, and the loss of identity. These are signs that the growth of the past 2 centuries has not always led to an integral development and an improvement in the quality of life. Some of these signs are also symptomatic of real social decline, the silent rupture of the bonds of integration and social cohesion.
I've chosen this quotation. There are many others, because I think here the Pope highlights the combination of social and ecological issues, and in a way he says that integral, he speaks of integral development, then he will speak of integral ecology, and in a way we can say that it's all about the quality of relationships. And when he will speak of the quality of life, he highlights this aspect, that we have to care for the just relationship of human beings among themselves, and quality of relationship between the human person and all beings on earth. And this is the way to reflect on our economic models. It has these economic models could be conceived in terms of quality of relationships enabled by these models or not. And I would like to develop this idea, showing how the Pope speaks about the challenges that our business and economic models have to face now. So when the Pope in the chapter, it's not chapter 5, it's 4 in fact, of the encyclical letter. So there are different aspects that he showed, that when we speak of integral ecology, it's environmental, economic and social ecology all together. So these aspects have to be combined. Then I think very important also, and it's related to the image of the polyhedron, the fact that ecology is also a matter, culture matters, and that we have to take into account the diversity of cultures in the world and the specific context where we try to think about the change in our economic models or lifestyles differently. And also cultural ecology is all about changing our representations of what a good life means. And then he goes back to the we could say classical principles of the Catholic or Christian social thought, the common good and justice. And justice not only within the same generation, but between generations. So how to care for future generations. Then, if I try to find a way to summarize what I understood of what the Pope said about businesses and integral ecology, and we could summarize it with the 4C, which is also a way to foresee the future. Conscience, then challenges, creativity, and capabilities. So I take one first, the issue of conscience. I don't know how to pronounce it in English. So there are many different kinds of issues. Here you have the desertification issues related to agriculture, urban areas. What do we do with our big cities? And then also how to respect and promote the diversity of cultures and fight against the homogenization of our lifestyles. Another quotation, I think, from I don't remember the chapter, I think it's the third chapter, where the Pope speaks about issues related to technology and the right use of technology.
Science without conscience. Our immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. Each age tends to have only a meagre awareness of its own limitations. It is possible that we do not grasp the gravity of the challenges now before us. The risk is growing day by day that man will not use his power as he should. In effect, power is never considered in terms of the responsibility of choice which is inherent in freedom, since its only norms are taken from alleged necessity, from either utility or security. But human beings are not completely autonomous.
So, here and in other parts of the encyclical letter, the Pope reflects on our willingness to be autonomous, and in fact, I think his analysis is not very far from, for example, what Ivan Illich was saying 40 or 50 years ago, when he was analyzing the challenges related to technology and science. And in a way, when the Pope said that we don't pay enough attention to the consequences of our technological choices, he highlights the fact that if we really want to promote a quality of relationship, we have to reflect on the way we developed technological innovations, and we have to ask ourselves whether we don't become more dependent and less autonomous because of these technological choices. And obvious example is related to junk food. I was speaking of this because we know that there are many illnesses related to junk food, like obesity and then diabetes and other. And if we were thinking of the root causes for these diseases or other social issues in our societies, the idea would be to act and to try to prevent these the problems before they arise, and reflecting from another perspective, trying to see how we can really become more, or making sure that the technology and science enable us to be more autonomous. It means combining autonomy and interdependence with one another and with nature. And in fact, what the Pope analyzes is the fact that we want to be more autonomous, but in fact we are not, and we are becoming slaves, or we are enslaved by different kinds of technologies, and he suggests for us to think differently. So we'll see how he promotes a change of mindset also in the way we conceive new technologies and new business models. I don't think I will too much insist on this quotation. It's just to show that in a way, if we reflect from a more theological perspective, the Pope suggests that we try to behave like God behaves toward His creation, and maybe you can read the last quote. Yeah.
Developing the created world in a prudent way is the best way of caring for it, as this means we ourselves become the instrument used by God to bring out the potential which He Himself inscribed in things.
And I think it's a beautiful way to describe that we can try to help other people develop their potential, but which means that we are not supposed to make decisions for the others, but we can try to promote a certain quality of relationships with all creation that enable each being to flourish. And it's also very interesting to see in the first quote, the ultimate purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us. It can be, I insist a little bit on this because it's quite new, because very often when we speak and when we are inspired by, for example, the book of Genesis, we say that the human beings have a very specific place in the creation, and here the Pope acknowledges the specific place of human beings, of human persons, but he also says that we have to fight against what in French we say anthropomorphisme déviant, devious anthropomorphism, the fact that sometimes we think that we have to care only for human beings and not to take into account in the same way other beings. And here in this encyclical letter, maybe I know that for Protestants it has been highlighted for quite a long time, but in the Catholic Church there have been many debates on this issue. And I think it's very interesting that the Pope highlights the fact that if we want to care for other human beings, we also have to care for all beings, and in a very respectful way. And that's, I think, St. Francis was doing this when he was speaking of all the creatures, brothers, Mother Earth, and Sister Mother Earth, and Brother Fire, and all these elements. But maybe we have lost it, and we know that some theologians and some Catholics were strongly opposed to the idea that we could also promote a respect for every being, and not only for human beings. So maybe we could discuss this afterwards, but I think it's worth underlining this. So then, second aspect after the issue of conscience is the challenges that we have to face, and the Pope in the encyclical letter describes different kinds of challenges. So here is a picture that I took a few years ago, because I went to Nigeria for like 13 years, I think. I led some surveys, some qualitative and quantitative surveys with Nigerian scholars, with other African scholars, and other economists from France. And it was our surveys were, the purpose was to try to assess the impact of oil production on the quality of social bonds in the local communities impacted by oil production. It was very interesting to be able to follow up the situation in some communities, some villages impacted by oil production, and to have interviews with local communities, people belonging to different families, and also we had discussions with people working in big oil companies, NGOs. And one major challenge that is obvious when you go there is the deterioration of the quality of social bonds. Not only the ecological problems are huge, and maybe in the media we speak more about ecology and ecological issues than about social and political issues, but in fact what is very frightening is to see that in these communities impacted by oil production, you have a deterioration of the quality of the and also of the level of trust among people who belong to the same family, That's one of the major results of our quantitative surveys. And of course, if you have this kind of evolution in the families, although in Africa we know that the people normally care a lot for the extended family, there is a strong sense of what it means to belong to a certain to the huge extended families. So this was very interesting and frightening to see that year after year you don't all the efforts done by oil companies or other institutions in order to try to promote what they call development, in fact, it is not in favor of local development on the long run. And in a way, all these CSR, corporate social responsibility programs and measures are counterproductive because they have fueled, in a way, nepotism, clientelism in these areas, and they have not promoted a better quality of life for the people. So that's a first challenges related to these kind of extractive industries which have a huge impact both on the soil, on the earth, and on the people. So maybe to reflect more on this, the Pope tries to see the problems related to a certain conception of CSR. And read.
The lure of the win-win approach. It is not enough to balance, in the medium term, the protection of nature with financial gain, or the preservation of the environment with progress. Halfway measures simply delay the inevitable disaster. Put simply, it is a matter of redefining our notion of progress. A technological and economic development which does not leave in its wake a better world and an integrally higher quality of life cannot be considered progress. Frequently, in fact, people's quality of life actually diminishes by the deterioration of the environment, the low quality of food, or the depletion of resources in the midst of economic growth. In this context, the social and environmental responsibility of businesses often gets reduced to a series of marketing and image-enhancing measures.
So, perspective, I don't know whether you agree completely or not with what the Pope says. When I give some presentations of the encyclical letter to different kinds of publics, sometimes I was presenting it to business people, and some of them were very angry about what the Pope said about CSR, because they said, no, it's not true, it's not only a question of reputation and image enhancing measures. Anyway, if we read carefully what the Pope says, he highlights the fact, I put the expression win-win approach. The Pope doesn't use this expression, but when he says halfway measures simply delay the inevitable disaster, he says that when we have these, we usually speak of sustainable development in terms of win-win or win-win-win situation, where we can combine economic growth, respect for the people and respect for the environment, and we don't highlight the possible tensions or contradictions between the objectives. And I think it's exactly what he denounces here, saying, if we do so, in fact, we just do it's business as usual, in a way, and it won't change the way we look at the challenges. And then he gives a positive criterion, because he says, in fact, we have to care for the people's quality of life. And if we assess the current situations, we can acknowledge that very often the quality of our life doesn't improve. For example, there are many more people are sick because of environmental problems. We're speaking of food and health issues. Then, if you are stuck into a traffic jam every day, your quality of life is not very good. Or we can give many examples of what it means to live a life which has a great quality. And here again, we can maybe go back to the idea that promoting quality of life is also a matter of relationships, quality of relationships. I will develop this later. A second issue is related to the inequalities in the value chain. I have put this picture of the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013, but we know that there are many. It was mediatized. It was very. We spoke a lot about this event and disasters in the media, but there are many other disasters that happen and we don't hear about them. So all these issues related to conditions, working and living conditions which are not decent for poor people. Also, we know about modern slavery. I think in the UK there was the Modern Slavery Act 2 or 3 years ago. So all these issues related to the fact that the big companies say that they are responsible only for their direct employees and that they have subsidiaries in other countries. Most of the time also they deal with subcontractors, and we know that, for example, for this industry, it was a subcontractor which subcontracts to other people, and then like number 10 subcontractor, number 10. So they don't want to follow up along the value chains the situation of the employees of these subcontractors. So there are many interrelated problems, and this is a major issue because we have promoted globalization. We say most, or at least the doxa was that globalization is supposed to foster a better quality of life for many people on Earth. And if we look at these issues, maybe we have to reflect differently on many challenges related to these global value chains. Here is the quote, maybe the most violent quote of the encyclical, if you can read it.
Sure. The culture of mass consumption and waste. The same kind of thinking leads to the sexual exploitation of children and abandonment of the elderly who no longer serve our interests. It is also the mindset of those who say, let us allow the invisible forces of the market to regulate the economy and consider their impact on society and nature as collateral damage.
And this is business as usual in a way. And neoclassical economics and all this, we say, well, it's inevitable to create, to have collateral damages, and every business that is conceived has social and ecological consequences and bad effects. And most of the time we think that the benefits related to this business and this economic activity is more important than the bad effects and the bad consequences. And here the Pope says, well, in fact, if our reasoning is like this, it may lead us to be as criminal in a way, in the way we are thinking about economic models, as if we have all these crimes like sexual exploitation of children, abandonment of the elderly. In fact, the same kind of mindset where we look for short-term personal interests, and we don't care for long-term and interests or challenges for the others. So this is a very strong stand, because then if we take this perspective seriously, it means maybe we have to conceive completely differently the way we reflect and we develop businesses, saying that we first have to take into account the consequences at all levels and make sure that the business that we envision is consistent with some social and ecological goals. then this is a picture that I took 3 years ago. I was doing some research on waste pickers, pepenadores, in Mexico, and we had a discussion with Diego, this man, well, very gentle person and very courageous, and we asked him where he would spend Christmas, and he said, well, I will be here because I have no family and I will just be here. And I think this is a symbol, but also the reality of this culture of waste, because there is waste all over the world, plastic and other kind of waste, but also we can say that some people are conceived as waste in a way because we don't take them into account and we don't really care for the consequences of our economic models on these people. So then, and a fourth problem related to business as usual is a priority usually given to the market over democracy. Can we?
This does not mean being opposed to any technological innovations which can bring about an improvement in the quality of life. But it does mean that profit cannot be the sole criterion to be taken into account, and that when significant new information comes to light, a reassessment should be made with the involvement of all interested parties. The outcome may be a decision not to proceed with a given project, to modify it, or to consider alternative proposals.
There are many parts of the encyclical where the Pope speaks about the classical or the cost-benefit analysis that we tend that is normally helpful in order to see whether a business is sustainable or it's profitable or not, and try to see how we can maximize profit while and in order it's supposed to be to share the economic and financial value then to different kinds of stakeholders. And here the question is to reflect on before a business starts and when businesses are envisioned, or different kind of industries, or any project which is related to the use of different kinds of resources, we have to conceive profit not as a sole criterion, and say that in other and profit has to be taken into account as a necessary means, but not as the objective, the goal in itself. And we have to make sure that the project is consistent with what people think in a given territory about the project, and then it has and generally speaking, the companies speak of informed consent of the population, but very often it's more formal it's formal and it doesn't have big effects on the decisions that are made, and most of the time the decisions are related to financial criteria. So here also it is the fourth problem, the fact that we think that the market is more important than democracy, because in fact people can raise a voice, but if their voice is not really taken into account, it means that financial issues and the market rules will prevail. So this is another big issue, and that's why the Pope says two things. He promotes a dialogue between business people and political authorities, but he also says that it's not enough, that very often the elites have the same perspective, and if we want to change things, civil society, NGOs, and people from the grassroots have to put pressure on the governments and on big businesses in order to change the regulation and change the way people and decision makers look at the decisions that have to be made. So this was the second part about after conscience, then challenges. So all these challenges related to a critique of the win-win perspective, critique of the global value chains where big businesses don't take their responsibilities seriously, and then problems related to to market or a kind of thinking that is first market oriented. Now, here's some pictures of mostly women. We put some women because also when we speak of democracy issues, it's also to make sure that women will be able to raise a voice. That some people say that the Pope didn't insist enough in the encyclical letter about women's rights and women empowerment. Since then, the Pope has expressed himself a lot about this issue, but so I wanted to highlight this aspect. So now about creativity, because some people say, well, the Pope is very critical about businesses and our economic models, but what does he suggest? So I think he's also very positive about the possibilities that we have.
A path of productive development which is more creative and better directed could correct the present disparity between excessive technological investment in consumption and insufficient investment in resolving urgent problems facing the human family. Such creativity would be a worthy expression of our most noble human qualities, for we would be striving intelligently, boldly and responsibly to promote sustainable and equitable development within the context of a broader concept of quality of life. On the other hand, to find ever new ways of despoiling nature purely for the sake of new consumer items and quick profit would be, in human terms, less worthy and creative and more superficial.
So, thank you. Beautiful quotation for highlight the fact that if we think differently about businesses, we also promote the dignity of every human person. And when he speaks of, he speaks about the quality of life as the main criterion that could be the criterion in order to start and develop new technological innovations and then new businesses. So I would like to, well, you know about like this kind of sharing economy, and there are many ways to describe new economic models. You can imagine that the ones who study management, you hear a lot about in French economic functionality, you know, to share, not to buy goods but to rent things. It's really like a circular economy, try to conceive every waste as a resource, and all this. It's a completely new way of looking at our lives and our possibilities. So the creativity can be huge, but then you have to have the willingness at different kinds of levels to promote this perspective. And for the time being, we know that the current trend in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the current trends are very frightening, which means that our current economic models and our current lifestyles are completely at odds with this idea that we have to promote a better quality of life for us and for future generations. So it means that in terms of changing the business models and the way we reflect on finance, accounting standards, and many taxation, wage distribution, we really have to promote new ways. So it means that creativity is about different kinds of sectors, but also it's a transversal perspective, and being able to change the metrics, the way we conceive and assess the economic models. And I do think that this is as important as reflecting with new renewable energies and specific areas. It's, if we want to change the way we run businesses, we really have to change the metrics. Otherwise, you still have these big companies which will say that they promote sustainable development, corporate social responsibility, but it's just a few best practices or part of their activity, but it's not translated into the strategy of these firms. And I work with some friends who are top executives in big companies, and they say that it's very frustrating and struggle, but it's almost impossible to change in a specific company if we don't change the rules of the game. So maybe we could discuss it later if you are interested in this, because I think it's a major challenge. So, and the fourth aspect of my talk is about promoting capabilities. The Pope doesn't speak directly about capabilities. The capabilities it's also related to the framework developed by Amartya Sen. Are you familiar with it? He got the Nobel Prize in economics because of his work on development. And the idea, I think it's a very simple and interesting idea, is to promote alternatives to assessment of quality of life in terms of GDP or GDP per capita. Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, who is a philosopher, and other people who speak in terms of capabilities, say that development is promoting the capabilities to do and to be of individuals and groups, which means that we have to take into account when we assess the quality of life, not only if people have access to material goods and services, and of course it's important, but we also have to pay attention to their culture. Is their culture respected? Can all people in a community take part in the decision-making process? For example, if we look at the situation of girls in many countries, the girls they don't play as much as boys because they have their mothers. And in fact, if we think that gratuitousness is a very important part of life, it has to see with play, and we have to promote and to ensure that the girls will be able to play also. It's just to give some different kinds of examples. And of course, if we reflect from an economic perspective, a classical economic perspective, we don't pay attention to these aspects of human life. And Amartya Sen and did other academics and also practitioners, we reflect with the capability approach. This kind of perspective help us assess the situation of the people from many different ways, and not only from a market perspective, because there are aspects of human life that cannot be and that shouldn't be in French marketized. I don't know if it's the right word, and monetized also. Yeah, monetized, maybe it's better. And so if we and I think I have insisted on the question of quality of life and quality of relationships are key aspects of in terms of human and integral ecology and integral development. So we could assess businesses trying to see how they try to maximize the quality of social and ecological bonds within the company and with different kinds of stakeholders. And I discussed a lot, and I wrote some books with some academics such as Guy Giraud, who is a Jesuit and currently the chief economist of the French Development Agency. And he's also reflecting on macroeconomic models that are consistent with this perspective. And we have also worked with top executives either in banks or in industries to try to figure out how we can move forward towards more consistent economic models. And it's very interesting to see how these people who have a social consciousness and who are also immersed in big businesses, how they try to see, even if there are many power relations in these big companies, try to see what could be the levers in order to change these businesses. And for me, it's a source of hope to see how people can take risks in order to raise awareness within the companies and also in civil society to help people reflect differently about our different kinds of responsibilities. So, well, that's the way I summarize some challenges and try to promote what I call a kind of eco-justice and apply it to businesses. It means that we have to take into account the conditions of a fair creation and sharing of the economic and financial value. It means that we have to think about production patterns and also distribution patterns. And I gave some examples of, according to me, necessary changes, revision of accounting standards. I think in the UK we can speak of full cost analysis in terms of accounting methods. Taxation, we could try to promote it's the American perspective on taxation, the apportionment model, which means that we try to have a taxation which is related to the places where the profit is made, and before the profit is shifted to tax havens or places where these big businesses or even sometimes countries have an interest in promoting fiscal evasion or fiscal optimization. But there many NGOs now promote some advocacy on this perspective, and I think it's very important if we want to promote a fair share of the wealth that has been created. Then there are also concerning global value chains. You know that there are in France we had a law last February on due diligence to try to prevent other disasters such as Rana Plaza. In fact, the law that was passed is not sufficient, but at least the idea is to ask big businesses to show every year what they will do in order to make sure that they won't be complicit of violations of human rights along the value chains. And it's interesting because currently at the UN level there are discussions going on in order to promote a binding treaty for multinational corporations on fundamental rights, to make sure that they won't be also to try to make sure that they won't violate human rights along the value chains. So I think these are positive steps forward, although for the time being we don't have this binding treaty, but at least it's discussed. The second dimension is about recognition of the people. Maybe it's related to the culture of waste, trying to promote ways of integrating most vulnerable people into our economic models. Try to see our businesses also with the eyes of people who are sometimes victims of the negative consequences of these businesses. And the third dimension is related to it's more political. It's about representation and participation of affected stakeholders in the decision-making processes. And I think it has also to see with non-violent issues. How can we assess the kind of violence created by also our current economic models, and try to promote another kind of political perspective which is in favor of non-violent means. And it could be translated also in terms of reflecting on non-violent businesses means, but because I am sure that all CEOs of big companies will say that they are not in favor of violence, but anyway, the consequences of the current activities are very violent for some people. So I think it's another major issue. So this is the way I try to summarize all these aspects to try to promote a holistic perspective on corporate responsibilities, and in order not only to focus on CSR as responsibilities toward the employees and towards some stakeholders, but trying to highlight the fact that the first responsibility is an economic and financial one, which has to see what I just mentioned about fair creation and share of this value, and try to combine all these aspects. Can be interesting in terms of communication for these companies and strategies, and the idea is to make sure that businesses will integrate in the core strategy these aspects related to CSR. But I don't like the term CSR because most of the time it's conceived as best practices, what companies will do above the law. Although in the European Union, you know that since 2011 there is a new definition of CSR as the responsibility of businesses about the impact of their activity, which is very interesting because it's really a change of mindset. It means that before it was conceived as philanthropy, now it's related to the direct and indirect impacts of business on different kinds of stakeholders. So it's much more related to what this kind of scheme, where I try to make sure that that the economic and financial aspect is not put aside. And just to finish, I propose this is, but you could ask questions if you are interested. The Relational Capability Index. It's an index that I built with Gaël Giraud to try to assess the impact of some different kinds of businesses on local development in terms of quality of social bonds. And so it has been used when we were carrying out surveys in Nigeria concerning the effects of oil production, also with the waste to assess the empowerment of the waste pickers in different countries. Also with the French Development Agency, we try to build an index which can enable us to compare the situation of countries in terms of social bonds. But of course, this kind of index, it's a bit paradoxical to assess the quality of life with a quantitative index. So of course, it's not enough. We have to combine quantitative analysis with a qualitative analysis of and rooted in the culture of the people, and we're discussing with anthropologists, sociologists, people who are aware of the context to try to assess the quality of social bonds. It's just that the index for our societies where people want KPIs, key performance indicators and all this, to give figures, for some people it's very important. And I'm very cautious about all these figures, but to try to put the emphasis on the quality of social bonds, I also think that it's very important. So if we can find ways to have people more, to make sure that people will be more sensitive to these issues, it's also important. And I would like just to finish with one quotation about the quality of relations and the combination of educational challenges and spirituality. And if you could read this quote on happy sobriety.
Happy sobriety. Such sobriety, when lived freely and consciously, is liberating. It is not a lesser life or one lived with less intensity. On the contrary, it is a way of living life to the full. In reality, those who enjoy more and live better each moment are those who have given up dipping here and there, always on the lookout for what they do not have. They experience what it means to appreciate each person and each thing, learning familiarity with the simplest things and how to enjoy them. So they are able to shed unsatisfied needs, reducing their obsessiveness and weariness. Even living on little, they can live a lot. Above all, when they cultivate other pleasures and find satisfaction in fraternal encounters, in service, in developing their gifts, in music and art, in contact with nature, in prayer. Happiness means knowing how to limit some needs which only diminish us, and being open to the many different possibilities which life can offer.
I will finish with this.